Good evening. I'm Socrates Garrett, and we're broadcasting live right here in Jackson, Mississippi, the heart of the Deep South, right here in the African-American owned broadcasting studio. We believe digital.com, our own platform. And so it's critically important that in the African-American community, we control the narrative. I look forward to receiving opportunities to show and advertise your products for goods and services and to move your brand along in this community. We're broadcasting live on Facebook. When We Believe Digital Podcast, go to Roku and download our app, and We Believe Global, with shows like this to bring articulate, intelligent conversations and dialogue to our platform. So I'm here to continue sounding the alarm. This is how the South is going to rise again. Good evening, and welcome to Socrates Garrett Live. We're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi, in the heart of the deep, deep South. In Mississippi, where we're last in every major category. We're the most obese state, most unhealthy state, the poorest state in the nation. And yet we strive to overcome. And we've been doing this for a long, long time, all the way back to the days of the plantation, when we were slaves in Mississippi. Right after the Indians, the Choctaw Indians, were banned from their homeland and marched off to Oklahoma City. And it was something called the Trail of Tears. Those of us who remained in Mississippi, our parents who remained in Mississippi after the Great Migration to the North, when African Americans left Mississippi by any means necessary, on trains and bus, on cars, some of them even walking, trying to get out of here. The quality of life was bad then, and it hasn't improved much now. Most of you know throughout this country that Jackson has experienced two major crises at the same time, a perfect storm. Our city is being invaded. The state of Mississippi has threatened to take over the city of Jackson. And the African-American leadership that we've elected to serve in the mayor's office and the city council seats have fought with one another to a standstill, and now we're threatened to have garbage being strode through our entire city because they cannot come to an agreement that a black man, Richards, ought to have the contract to pick up the garbage out of Jackson, Mississippi, even though he was $1.2 million a year less than his competitor, Waste Management. At the same time, the state has taken over our drinking water plant, and now the operation of the plant is being done by Mississippi Department of Health. Our airport was under siege last year, where the state tried to take it over from black leadership in Jackson. We now have two police departments operating within the same confines in the same 5-mile area, and we don't know exactly what the structure is. We don't know if one police department rolls up to the mayor. We don't know where they take their arrests, how they're prosecuted. We don't know where would they find them, where those dollars for the fine go. Do they go inside of Jackson, or do they go to other surrounding cities? We just don't know. We do know that we're in big trouble down here in Jacktown. We do know that. A city under siege. Some say the crisis of the day is in Ukraine. I say the crisis of today is in Jackson, Mississippi, where the real test is going to be told in just a day or two as to who, in fact, runs Mississippi and who runs Jackson. Is it the folk that black folk elected to run the city that's running it, or is it the folk that are in the state capitol being controlled by outside influences from other parts of the country, or they running the city. Now, we're broadcasting live on Facebook, on YouTube, on Roku TV, and our very own platform, WeBelieveDigital.com. My guest, as always, my co-host, that is the Dr. Eldridge Henderson, a man that needs no introduction, one of the most sought-after speakers in this country, who is lecturing throughout this entire country, who's running training modules, who's trying to tell African Americans what their future looks like if they don't do certain things. A man that was born on the plantation and then became a doctor in education, served his time in the military, did everything right. And yet, we find that he's not far from the plantation that he was born on in 2022. Dr. Henderson.
Yes, sir.
It's always good to see you and good to have you in the studio.
Thank you, Mr. Socrates. Thank you very much. You are exactly right. We are in trouble in America. We are in trouble in Mississippi, the South, and the world. And instead of things get better economically, politically, and socially, they're getting worse.
Doc, tell us a little bit about Mississippi back in the day. You can't teach history in Mississippi because the governor banned the critical race theory. So our children and our audience are only going to know history if we bring it to them. You haven't been born on the plantation. What was it like?
Well, it was a very difficult period in my life after I turned 18. I didn't know it was difficult until I turned 18 when I had a chance to get off the plantation, and I found that there was something called a wage more than $2 a day. I found out that one could finish high school and attend college. I also found out that one could compete for jobs in the community. All of that was totally new. I was locked in from, say, about 6 years of age until 17 on the plantation, making $2 a day when we were able to work for the landowner. Now, most of the time we spent working on the plantation for ourselves on shares, and we never got out of debt during the 17 years. But when I started making that $2 a day, I was considered a man then, and I had planned to get a house in Bolton, Mississippi, in that area, because I had no plans to go into high school. I had a house set, I had a job that was guaranteed, and I was told if I could survive for 6 months, I would be able to get a used car from the used car lot down in Raymond, Mississippi. The boss had a used car lot and was going to pay for that car out of my $2 a day. That's my upbringing, and I didn't know anything was wrong with that. That's what we all did in that area. All the men, all the black men that didn't work on the plantation had jobs in Jackson, Vicksburg, and many were smart enough to have day jobs, work an hour or two in the morning before they would get on that truck and go to Vicksburg or Jackson for a job, come back at 6 or so and work until dark on the plantation. And all of them had jobs on Saturdays and many on Sundays just to feed the family. And at that time, something happened then that's not happening now. Every household had a male in it. Whether it wasn't, might have not been a legal male, but they had a lot of common law marriages where I was from, and there was a dad everywhere. And that made the young people better. They were raised to work, to sit down, keep your mouth shut, and do what you were told. And if you didn't do that, you didn't have to make an error but one time, and you were given a good look and a back slap, and you were quiet until you left that house at 18, 19, or 20.
Well, Doc, I said that Mississippi is last in every major category. Now, why is that, in your opinion?
Well, it's because I have to tell you, sir, is a twofold reason. One is because it is a designation that was set back in the early days before Mississippi became a state. The Mississippi Territory was controlled by the Europeans, And the local immigrants that call themselves white Southerners at the time decided to build this area. Eventually they made it into a state, and they decided to take over and get slaves with twofold purpose, black and Indian slaves. Since the Indians didn't work well with the whites, they decided to put them against each other and the blacks, and made blacks the total slaves most of that period up until, I would say, the 1950s. Now, slavery is supposed to have been abolished in 1865. It only lasted for about 7 or 8 years. That was during the period of Reconstruction. And after about 1872 or 73, we had slavery back in America, and especially in the southern states. And I can't let the northern states go because they were a little worse than the South, because the people were locked in, locked out, and they were given hard times economically in the northern part of the country.
So blacks were catching hell wherever they were.
That's right. Now, let's be clear. This is not only the black problem. There are many other minorities in this country, too, that were catching hell at the time. The Jews, the Hispanics, the few that were here, the Indians, the Chinese. But all those folks did something that black people didn't do. They decided to organize, pool their resources, build communities, and not want to be white. Black folks have always been told that if you want to be right, you have to be white. They were told that in the plantation by the owners. They were told that by the white preachers. They were told that by the Bible. They were told that by the black preachers. And all times they were told, you need to be superior like us. We are the boss. You listen to us and you will be saved. And that's why black folks never made major rebellions in this country, just a few attempts. And that is the story of black folks. And today, we are still the most passive group in the history of America.
Why didn't the Indian make a good slave, Doc?
Well, because they were, first of all, they were not familiar with that kind of work. Most of the Indians were settled type, plain Indians. They moved from place to place. They had a village here or there. They pick it up and move the whole family and follow the herd. They did have some that had towns and were practicing agriculture, and they had governments and so forth. But that was sort of rare. Most of the Indians were not a harmonious group. They had a lot of different tribes, a lot of different languages. I read once they had over 200 different languages and about 500 different dialects among those Indians at that time. So they couldn't work well in confined areas. And they found that that black man from Africa could weather the heat. He already knew what hard work was. He was an expert in agriculture and building. And they finally said, the Indians are not good for us, so they decided to integrate with them, started a new group that they made into what we call mulattoes, mestizos, and so forth, and put them against blacks, Mr. Socrates. And black folks joined the Indians eventually as they got away from some of the plantations, and now we are still running from plantation.
Now, were there any Indian tribes in Africa?
Not at all. No, none, to my knowledge.
That's amazing. You think it was because of the climate, or you think why is it that the Indians didn't populate the continent of Africa?
Well, because that's a black nation. The people that populated Africa in the original days were black people, and as the black people migrated north, east, and west, they eventually changed their colors through the European area, the mountain areas, and others throughout generations. They became hybrids. They gradually changed their color, their structure, and of course they moved around from Africa, went across the strait into Europe and Asia and other places, and that's where a lot of people say the so-called American Indians came from. And at the same time, they had another group in Latin America, which you might call them mestizos or whatever, and Utahns. But those people, too, came from Africa through various ways, and all the men and women originally came from Africa. That's why you didn't have any on the African continent, on the original African continent, according to what I've been reading.
Wow. We're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi. We're having a conversation with Dr. Henderson. We're talking about history. We're talking about the things that African Americans had to work through in order to have a chance to prove that they were worthy of the benefits of the Constitution of the United States of America. To become a full first-class citizens was their dream. In every turn, except a brief period during Reconstruction, African Americans were denied the opportunity to raise a family, to get an education, to participate in mainstream economy. A lot of black leaders died fighting to try and elevate the standard of living in black communities. We all know about the assassination of Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Vernon Damon. And there's so many more untold stories of people that gave their lives trying to improve the conditions for African Americans. Now we're getting ready to go to a station break, and we'll be right back, and we're going to talk about some solutions to the current problem. We dealt with where we came from. We're going to talk about where we are, and then we're going to talk about how we change our condition. So I want you to stay tuned. We'll be right back after this commercial.
Advertise on WeBelieve.Global, a brand new digital media platform. Share your brand with our audience on our many global live stream TV broadcasts and over the radio. For more info, visit WeBelieve.Global or call 800-492-5186, option 1.
And welcome back to Socrates Garrett Live. We come to you each and every Friday at 5 p.m. We're broadcasting live in over 139 countries. We're being seen on YouTube, on Facebook, on Roku TV, and our very own platform, WeBelieveDigital.com. We're networking throughout this world to try and develop a media company that black folk with similar ideas and concepts can share and talk about their problems. One of the worst things in the world is to be isolated, to be cut off from the rest of the world and not have the benefit of what has worked in other regions. So we're talking to Rob Neal down in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who owns the radio station down there. And we're talking to Mr. Williams up in Indiana, who owns WONG over in Canton, Mississippi. We're talking to Jerry Mason down in Florida, who Boogie has the Boogie Report. We're talking about how we all can work together, how we can put this company together and make it have tremendous meaning. You see, we can't allow others to tell our story. That's how we got this bad history report that we have now. That's why our black children have low self-esteem, because they know nothing about their history. They know nothing about the time when they were kings and queens and when they ruled and created civilization and were the scientists and the inventors of all things that came into the universe. And so somehow we got to be able to tell that story for them. And so we're attempting to do that. So if you're on Facebook, I want you to share and send stars. If you're on our website, I want you to go to the donate button and send us a donation. so that we can continue this good work. You know, we also have an affiliate with a nonprofit, New South Development and Training. If you'd like to make your contributions there in order that you will have tax-deductible benefits, then reach out to us there. You know, it's critically important that we do this work because, as I said earlier, we are under attack. Dr. Henderson, when I say we're under attack, I believe that we are under attack with a lot of friendly fire, as we would have said in the Army back in the day, that black folk are killing each other at an alarming rate. Why is that?
Well, it's because we do not love ourselves anymore. Most people know from observation, from reality, and from specific facts that black people in America do not love themselves as they did 50 years ago. We are in a position economically and socially and politically, believe it or not, Mr. Socrates, where we have no control, no power, and we are at what I call a standing point of no return, because the enemy, who I call the European Americans, have already said, if I control the money, I control the minds and the destiny of the people. And since black people have taken over various towns and cities, we are going to use the money and take it back. And we won't have to fire a shot. And that is exactly what's happening in the South, in the North, in the East, and in the West. You have the politicians and corporate leaders and designated ministers in the black community working as networkers. They are building a system where the European Americans are going to take over the cities again because they had the economic power to do so, and do their best to keep the black folks divided and bring all kinds of things in that they are supporting, like the LGBTQ community, Black Lives Matter, and all these other militias that's coming in. All of them have segments of the population that have been dispersed into little camps, and they are fighting each other, and that's why the people controlling the money are going to take these towns and cities and put black folks, and I'm saying blacks exclusively, in urban and inner city relocation camps. That is the history, and that's the plan.
Can you see evidence of that in Jackson and other southern cities?
All over the place. That's right. They started in Jackson about 15 years ago when they started redeveloping certain buildings downtown Jackson. We have mentioned many times during the last few years that that is a Pacific design where the inner city people are going to be pushed out of Jackson economically because they can't afford to live in the rehab structures downtown at the old hotels and other places. And you also find that the city has been cordoned off by the legislature, where there have been certain segments in Jackson been taken away from the city administrators, given special funds, special commissions set up to control them, like what we call a shadow government, and they are making rules and regulations, and the legislature is condoning that activity because they generate it. And this is excluding blacks again. And it's going to get to the point where the black mayor of Jackson, whoever he or she might be in the next 3 to 5 years, not going to have North and Northeast Jackson as part of incorporated Jackson, Mississippi, as the city. It'll just be on the map, but it will not be controlled by the mayor. They already have their economic development councils. They already have their police. And the legislature and the judges are going to make sure it's going to be promoted that the white people control North and Northeast Jackson. And they're going to put the screws on West Jackson and South Jackson, cut them off fundingly, of course, and they are not going to be able to prosper. And they are going to give up and take over, and that's the plan.
Now, will African Americans vote well in that kind of a regime? We're not doing well under black leadership, Doc. You have to admit that the struggle that we're currently having under black elected officials has not elevated the black community to the extent that we had hoped that it would. So under this new concept that you're talking about, how will black folks fare?
Well, under the new concept, they're not going to fare very well. Now, since this is in the beginning process, it's been going on about 15 years in Jackson, black people in Jackson, Mississippi still have an opportunity to control their area, where they are, with their own resources, with their own leaders, if they would pool the resources and start building communities. I've been telling you and others for years, black people have the economic wherewithal to do what they want to do. All black folks in Jackson and Hinds County are not broke. They have some of the most educated folks in the state, right here in the Jackson metropolitan area. Black people own land. They own all kinds of things in this area. But they will not pool the resources because they've been so brainwashed that they have to leave the inner city, move to the suburbs, and 2 or 3 get into gated communities, and they think they're in heaven. Matter of fact, a lot of black people don't have to die to go to heaven. Some think they're in heaven already. And that means they are going to disregard their black relatives and friends and think that they are part of the upper crust, and they are used as tools, Mr. Socrates, just like they did some of the Indian chiefs, to fight each other and say, I'm your favorite. And then when they fought them down to just 2 groups left, they decided then they're going to have those 2 groups to fight, and the winner then would be shipped off to Oklahoma and other places. And that's what's going to happen to the black folks.
Well, we won't fare well then.
Not at all.
We're going to be relegated to a position that is less than what our grandparents experienced. Because back then, we did have land. Now, I know that black families in Madison County own all of the land in Madison County for the most part. And today, they don't hardly own any. And I wondered how that came about. But then I learned, as you just said, you know, when you take over and incorporate an area and change the zoning from agriculture to commercial or residential, your taxes skyrocket. And poor blacks were unable to pay the high taxes on their land, and so they lost it at the tax sale. And that happened throughout Mississippi, especially in southern Madison County, which is probably the wealthiest county in the state of Mississippi.
And I agree with that. That's exactly correct. That's part 1. Part 2 was when they incorporated the areas, and black folks were told that prior to incorporation, I will buy your land for $200 or $300 an acre. When they got it incorporated, they would tell certain members that had allegiance to white that we want to buy your land and we'll give you maybe $1,000 an acre. And since this land was not put up in wills and life estates, the individual blacks that were greedy, that had no sense of money, no sense of what I call collectivization, said, I'm going to sell my part. And that's what the people knew some would do. And they would concentrate on the black people that usually worked very closely with white people as janitors, as maids, and so forth, and the yard boys. They were considered the favorites. That's that favorite deacon that will have a decent suit on every 2 or 3 years that he got from the white boss. And those are the people they would go to and say, I want to buy your land. They were used to sell it, and then the white judges and white lawyers will have a public auction and get it all.
Wow.
That's the second part. And you mentioned the first part, how they got that land.
Right. And that happened all throughout the South.
Still happening today.
And we wonder why blacks don't own any land. And we don't know that systematically the process was put in place to either take the land from them through tax sales or through, as you just explained, some other process where somebody sold their part in air property and split all this up.
Now, let me tell you another one that I read about some years ago when I was studying Mississippi history and the history of the South. Another strategy they use, and this is a historical fact, a lot of the southern counties would go and say the courthouse has been burned down and we lost all the records. Mm-hmm. And that's the way they took a lot of black land. So blacks they didn't have it surveyed. They had a stick on a corner and another rod somewhere else. They knew for several hundred years where their land boundaries were, but it wasn't recorded. And since some were smart enough to get it recorded, the European Americans just say, well, we're going to take it all by burning the courthouse down. We have no records. And then they started moving on the land. They encroached upon those areas that black used to own and kicked them off that way.
Wow.
And then if they didn't want to leave, they gave them a plus. They sent their buddies in called the Ku Klux Klan, and other militias started hanging them and shooting them and throwing them in the Pearl River, the Black River, and the Chickasaw River and others, and they decided to leave and go to your hometown up there in Chicago, Philadelphia, and other places. And that's why, Mr. Socrates, I'm telling all these black folks to come back to Mississippi. Allegedly, black folks consist of about 37%. We know anytime the government says something, they use the 5 or 10% off. If black folks will leave New York, California, Chicago, and other places, move back to Mississippi, and get about a 55% population growth, we can control this state and wouldn't have to fire a bullet.
If we, in fact, control the state, would we be better off? Because we control the city and the county, and yet we get less than 5% for contracts for goods and services, and 40% of our population lives below the poverty line. Would we fare better under black leadership?
Not under the present structure and the present trained black leaders. I've been telling you sometime the leadership's going to have to change in Mississippi and the South. The churches and community organizations are going to have to get together and put training programs together to train their own future leaders, the politicians, the preachers, and the corporate leaders, and put them in power positions and make sure with a bigger population, they then would be on statewide or state-level jobs. They'd be in the legislature. You have a majority of blacks in the legislature, and it wouldn't make no difference whether Republicans, Democrats, or Progressives, or whatever they want to call themselves. They'll be in a position where they can determine the money, and blacks will prosper somewhat, but still you will have those enclaves of what I call high-powered elite that consider themselves black. They will be trying to do some things that they were accustomed to 30 or 40 years hence. But things will get better economically if we train our own leaders and disassociate ourselves with the sons and daughters of the present elected and appointed officials and the preachers.
Wow. So you're saying we got to start over.
Got to start over. That's with new leadership.
I remember back on the farm when my granddaddy told me that I needed to plow under the crop, the corn that I had planted, and I had worked on it and planted it, and it had come up, and then the rain came and it stayed wet so long I couldn't get back in there to chop the weeds out, and the weeds took over, and he said plow it under. And I said, no, I have put too much work in this, I'm going to have to save it. He said, you got to plow it under and start over.
That's what we got to do as black folks in America and the world. The good news is, Mr. Garrett, black people, population-wise, and people of what we call dark hue, can control the world, population-wise. But all over the world, black people have allowed the Europeans to come in and indoctrinate them to the point where they believe in this white Jesus and this white Bible. And the white Catholics and other religious denominations have always sent their people first to get them trained to become part of them religiously, and then give them that false and fake Bible, that revised version, and told them, you are important, but we are your boss here on earth, and you honor us and love us, and we'll take care of you when you die. Black folks still believe it.
Wow. Indoctrination.
I guarantee it works every time.
Indoctrination. We're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi. We've been seen in over 139 countries. You can catch us on Roku TV, on YouTube, on Facebook, and our very own website, WeBelieveDigital.com. You can call in and join our conversation at 800-492-5186. If you're on Facebook, we want you to hit the share button, and we want you to send us stars. If you're on the website, go to the donate button. And we need the revenue to continue bringing you important programs like this. Now, we're getting ready to go to a commercial break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some things that are specific to the conditions of the folk in Jackson, Mississippi, and Hinds County. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
Let's read and learn together. Meet Mason. Written by Sherry Tate. Illustrated by David. Mason is a young, inspired learner. Walk with him as he uses his 5 senses to explore the world around him. Your young one can learn to identify shapes, numbers, letters, and more with Meet Mason. Available now on Amazon.com.
Socrates Garrett ENT.com is a diversified firm specializing in recycled aggregates and crushed concrete. Socrates Garrett ENT.com's recycled materials provide the construction industry with significant economic and environmental benefits by recycling clean concrete rubble into M.Dot grade rock materials. Recycled aggregates and crushed concrete can be applied to driveways, road construction, bank protection, parking lots, general bulk fills, and more. By using Socrates Garrett ENT.com's crushed concrete products, anyone from homeowners to general contractors can help reduce landfilled concrete waste, conserve natural resources, and gain significant economic savings on materials and disposal costs. For more information, please call 601-896-0084 or visit us online at SocratesGarrettENT.com.
Welcome back. You're watching Socrates Garrett Live with my co-host, Dr. Eldridge Henderson, and we've been talking about things that affect the African American community. And it's a national problem. It's not local just to Jackson, Mississippi. You know, it's universal when it comes to African Americans. And so those of you that are watching in other parts of the country, we know that you share the struggle and you understand the difficulties that African Americans are having, trying to get a toehold, trying to move up. You know, Governor Haley Barbour said that we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And Martin Luther King once said, how can a bootless man, pull himself up when he doesn't even have boots? And so, you know, there have been programs put in place to create the conditions that we find ourselves in. And now we got to change all that. We got to change all that. And we got to get inside of our black community, and we got to come together, which we have not been able to do for a while. And I don't know why we have that divide. When I was a young African American and James Brown came out with "I'm Black and I'm Proud," and we had the Black Power salute, every time you met a brother or a sister on the street, you gave them the Black Power salute and you pump your chest as meaning "I love you," and you kept walking. We have none of that in the black youth of today. We have none of the togetherness that we enjoyed when in the 1970s and 80s. We just are in a position now where we are in a continual spiral downward. And Dr. Henderson, what does the forecast look like for African Americans in the coming months and years?
It looks very dim, sir, economically, politically, and socially. Now, one of the lead-ins that I'm going to put in here is what you just said and show you the situation. You were talking about how proud blacks were, young ones, especially during the 50s and early 60s. Black young men and women were protesting, demonstrating, serving as teachers, marching, fighting, going to jail. And right now, their grandchildren are only doing social things. They're on the internet. They're doing TikTok. They're joining community organizations and marching. But they're not marching for anything of any significance. They don't organize like they did at Tougaloo and Jackson State, where they get hooked up with politics. They get with the teachers' unions and others and work for teachers' pay. Right now, they have no youth that I know of that's organized and help the public workers in Hinds County and the city of Jackson get a pay raise. In the 1960s, they fought for those kind of things. They helped those folks get a pay raise so they can feed their families and not have to work 4 and 5 jobs. Now you find the middle class college students are partying. They are having a great time. They like to get together and do a little drinking, smoking a little dope. They like to join organizations, call them fraternities and sororities, get into gangs, and have a lot of little social events and drink a little tea every now and then. That's basically what they're doing. But 30, 50, 60 years ago, the students were organizing. And today they could change this if they would start thinking that we have the expertise we need in these local colleges and universities. In 3 to 5 years, the college students in Jackson can get together with as many other college students in this area, have 5 major universities in Jackson, and we can run our own mayor. We have law students who just graduated from law school the last 2 or 3 years. They can get in the legislature. They can be on the city council. All of these young people that are 19 to 20 can start running for office. When they turn 21, 25, and 30, they can be as far as the Mississippi legislature or in the House of Representatives in the next 5 to 7 years if they would start organizing and use what they did during the 1960s.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. I mean, where are the Angela Davises, the H. Rap Browns, the Malcolm X's, the Martin Luther Kings, the Al Sharptons, the Jesse Jacksons, the Medgar Evers, the Fannie Lou Hamons, Harry Tubmans? Where did the void come that we are experiencing now in our 40-year-old black leaders? That's when you step into the limelight. 40 years old, you probably got it figured out now that you got to fight for the betterment of your community. I don't see that in our community, Doc.
Well, sir, the body is still there, but not the mind. Now, a lot of you all criticize me because I say everything that's happening today and always has were something that were planned. These things were planned. So to castigate the black man, all you have to do is give him an illusion of education and then finance it for him and get him in debt. And up until just a few weeks ago, the black man in the age range you mentioned is under so much debt, especially those that started at college and went to college from 1 to 4 or 5 years, and especially those who went to graduate school. They are so deeply in debt they can't afford to run for public office, because they have put themselves in an economic situation where they're trying to own a home, they are trying to own 2 or 3 cars, and they pay in 5 or 6 notes continuously, daily and weekly and monthly, using credit card, $5,000 to $30,000 in debt. They can't afford to be the carmakers. They are just barely living. And if one gets sick, they'll lose everything they have. That's why they are not fighting. They're looking for that dollar. They're trying to pay those debts off. They're trying to live like the Joneses. And they are definitely suffering psychologically. Many of them are not mentally well. And they are under a lot of stress and anxiety. And that's why they can't stay married. They are divorcing and separating. And then the kids are going back to grandparents and great-grandparents. And the mothers and fathers not training the kids anymore because they are still out there suffering and working, trying to pay off that debt. And those 45 and under to about 30 are trying to get married again. And then you get all these blended families together, and many times, and I have some in my family like that, they forget the first set of children that the grandparents have. They raise that new set, And then the man has to work twice as hard because he is paying child support indirectly to his mother or grandmother while he's trying to raise that young family. And here he is, 40 to 55, with kids 10 or younger, and got others 20 and 25, and they have their own sets of grandchildren. They are not married at this time, and he's worse off than his father was in the 1960s.
And so we got to help him. We need that generation to step up. I mean, you and I, Doc, are in the fourth quarter. And we realize that, we come here every week, twice a week, and we talk about the things that are bothering us as it relates to the way we see our community and our children that we depend upon. You see, the number one reason that a man works, one is for the economic benefits of his work so that he can feed his family, provide basic shelter and clothing and things of that nature. But the other reason he works is because of the legacy, that he wants to leave something significant and make a contribution that others, especially those in his family, will have a head start. Now, we are not getting this right. We're not successful at this, Doc. And so I understand that we got to start over and we got to start training, but if our children keep experiencing the same trap that you just outlined, then I don't see any way out for them. I don't see how they're supposed to get out of the trap that they're in. How do you say they can get out?
Well, there are two ways to get out of that trap. One is, I mentioned the fact that the young man now, and I'm talking about black males and the black female, are under so much debt. Now, as you know, your current President Biden has alleged and has acted on some relief where they're going to have to be reducing that student loan that they have, so some of black's going to be escaping that student debt. And they will get to a point where they'll be able to economically do better for themselves and their families. But the bad part about it is this very group that I mentioned, that's, I would say, from 25 to 45, most of them have been divorced or separated, and that's going to make it so difficult for them to pool their resources with these blended families that it won't help them very much at all, but it will help some. And the other part that's going to be negative in our community, with the black female in a position where she can't find a comparable husband educationally and economically, since she has the skills, she's the college graduate, she has nobody that she wants to marry unless she marries out of her race. And these young men that's eligible to marry, they know they don't have to because they have a choice between 3 to 5 individuals. And these ladies think that they just have to have a child before they are 30 or 35. So these college graduates are having these children by these hoodlums and married men and all kind of folks, and that's making the generation deteriorate to the point where it's going to be worse again than it was in the 1960s.
Well, we're going to have to change that. Doc, I don't want to say that integration was the beginning of the downfall of the black family and structure, but it seems to have had a major role in causing this divide that we currently see. What's your thought?
Well, I would say you're exactly right. Now, I've been criticized for at least 30 years when I said that there were two things that were a hindrance to the success of the black man. One was slavery for 500 or 600 years, or whatever you want to call it, and integration. Prior to integration, the black man was in a position where all he had to do is defend himself, continue to pool his resources, and build his cities and towns and communities, and they would be in good shape. But you had certain people to come along, and this is where I'm criticized, called the Civil Rights Movement. People like Andrew Young, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others, they were seduced to believe, because they had that education and training at these white universities and started off at the black college, and then they got the master's programs, went to these white schools, and they met certain white people that pretended to be liberals. And they told them black folks, you are special. You up here in this medical program, in this law school, in this graduate program at Michigan State and Penn State and other places getting master's degrees, law degrees. You are special. We want you to work with us. We want you to become part of us. We're going to give you a job. They didn't say, we're going to give you some money so you start a business. And people like Dr. Martin Luther King, Andrew Young, and many of those others that I don't name, you name them all, they said, we are not going to practice independence. We want to integrate because we want to be like the white folks. We want to look like them. We want to talk like them. We want to live with them. We want to go to their churches and their schools. And even black folks got so crazy, they started going to the white churches and they was kicking them out like they were slaves. During slavery, they would let them sit in the back. But when I was a young man, when you would go to a church in Jackson, a black person, or in Alabama or somewhere, they'd kick your butt out on Sunday morning from the front door, throw you downstairs, throw you out in the basement somewhere, call the police on you, and stand there with pistols in their coat. Now, I didn't ever see them, but I bet they had pistols in their coat, blackjacks and all kind of things. And their preacher was preaching and worshiping and talking about Jesus. And some of the black folks got themselves killed and went to jail to go to these white churches in the South and in the North, not even wanted. And if they had kept on working as independent black folks, building their own cities and neighborhoods and so forth, pooling their resources, they would be better off today. Integration and slavery.
Two of the worst things
ever happened to black people in the history of the world.
Wow. Well, now, the enemy was ruthless. When we had Black Wall Street over in Carolinas, they burned it down. The Europeans came through, burned it to the ground because they did not want to see black independence and the black economy being practiced in that area. And so black people have had a hard way to go. So in that case, even when you tried to remain separate and do well and build your community and build your own economy, you were under attack then.
That's correct.
And so I don't know whether there's ever been a time that the African Americans have not been under attack since they came to this country.
There's never been a time, except in a few instances. See, the reason why the European Americans call black people bastardized is because they know they control them and they know they fear them. But there were some instances during the Civil Rights Movement where they had a group called the Deacons for Defense. And when the white Klan and the police would come to a black community and do some underhanded activity like killing and raping, the Deacons for Defense leadership team would go to the sheriff and some of the corporate leaders and say, I understand you all are burning churches in our community, you're killing people. We're going to tell you right now, we know who is doing this, and it better not happen again. And it stopped happening. But what black folks do, when they are not organized, when they get harassed like that, burn the towns down, hang them and throw them in the river, they get up and pray and then leave town. They don't fight back. But I told you, in the history of the world, every nation, every group that fought back gained respect from their enemies. And they left them alone to the point where they can let them be independent in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the state, or certain part of the county.
But they had to band together.
And they had to fight.
And they had to fight together.
I mean, physical fight. You have to do unto others as they do unto. I didn't say do unto others as they do unto you. You do unto others collectively as they do unto.
I got you, Doc. Now we're coming to the end of our program for this evening, so I want to deal with Jackson's crisis. And I want you to just let you and I talk about it a minute. The mayor issued an RFP, a request for a proposal for someone to pick up garbage in the city of Jackson a year ago or so. And he could not get the approval of the city council on the firm that he recommended. So he went into an emergency contract with that firm, even though he didn't have a contract with them. And that firm, Richards Disposal Service, which happens to be African-American owned, started to pick up the garbage in our city and has done so for the past 6 months. Our city council, 5 African-Americans out of 7, has said that they will not pay Richards Disposal for picking up the garbage, and they have not paid him in 6 months. So now Mr. Richards has let it know that he will not pick up garbage in the city of Jackson after Saturday. That's tomorrow. And there is not a provider in place to pick up the garbage in Jackson if Mr. Richards holds his word. That means the garbage will be on the streets of Jackson all over the city. Doc, what will it take for us to learn how to lead? And why is it that an African-American majority electoral and majority citizen can't come together and make a decision? And will this actions that are going on today allow the state of Mississippi to revoke the charter for the city of Jackson and take it over?
Well, that can happen, but I don't expect that to happen.
Okay.
I've been telling you all a long time. Some of you all disagree. Richards going to be paid eventually. I understand that they negotiate on a payment right now as we speak. And I do know if they go to court, especially if they get to the federal courts, they're going to be paid. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I've done the research. If you work and you don't stop one from working and you use their services, they're going to get paid eventually. The city of Jackson has 2 major problems, water and garbage. They can solve the garbage problem in 3 days. 1, they could pay Richards a fair price for what he has done. Could give him a real contract after they negotiate in private. They can rehire waste management, or they can give them a dual contract in various manners. You know, they can negotiate that. Because if they don't do that, get the garbage picked up, they already had a water problem. They have lead in water, especially close to the areas where the residents are in these old cities with these old pipes. Even though the water is cleared at the pumping stations in many parts. So in the next 3 months, you're going to have serious garbage problems if they don't solve it in the next 3 or 4 days. The water problem is going to become worse because you're going to have boiled water notices. And you heard the lady tell us from Flint, Michigan, that boiled water is not safe at all. And you're going to have the garbage problem, the water problem. You have the city workers, public works in the county and the city of Jackson protesting they're not getting paid. The police department is being diminished to the point where they are competing for wages with the city police. I call them the Capitol Police. They already have 2 inner city police forces. You know, they got the downtown city police force, the Jackson City Police Force, and now the Capitol team. A lot of people have forgotten about the 3rd force, the one that's downtown. That's 3 of them right there in the city of Jackson, 3 police divisions. They all have different leaders. They all have different streams of income. And the 2nd police force, downtown Jackson, is getting paid by the city of Jackson to maintain security downtown in a lot of these corporate businesses. A lot of people don't know that. So you got 3 different police managers in one little town, and the money is being generated in their regard versus being negligent for the city administrators. And they got those boys and girls fighting among each other, and that's exactly what they want them to do so they can ease in. When you fight around somebody and get them fighting, you can ease around and take their goods and services without shooting a bullet. And that's exactly what they're doing in some of these major cities. But if the black politicians would get together, fuss and fight and curse in private, and in 3 days come up with a solution for the water and the garbage and pay those workers and start looking at salary upgrades in the city with the police, doing competitive salaries, doing the surveys they need, and they don't need to do no commission to do it. They can pull it up on the internet and find out what the police are being paid, what city workers are being paid, where to find people to manage the water supply. All this can be done in 3 or 4 days.
So if the garbage piles up on the street, what should the citizens of Jackson do?
They ought to call on all the current elected and appointed city heads and people that are elected to resign in 2 weeks.
You heard it here on Socrates Garrett Live. I hope you've enjoyed the dialogue between Dr. Henderson and I as we talk about issues that are facing our community. You know, we got to get the problem out on the table. You can't solve the problem until you identify and put the problem on the table. Not what the symptom of the problem is, but what the real problem is. And right now, the problem is ineffective leadership in our elected African American officials who have not gone in the back room in private, as Dr. Henderson said, and come out with a solution, standing there together, even though you mad as hell, but standing there together. No different than when my mother, you know, when I would be fighting with my siblings and my mother would come in and she whipped the hell out of all of us, and then she said, go hug your sister. Go hug your brother. That was the hardest thing at all. I'd rather have another beating than they go over there and hug him. But I knew that she meant business. And what Dr. Henderson is saying is that we got to teach our young folk that we put in place, that we depend on. You see, we have no alternate. We have no alternative. We have to develop black leadership. We have to make that work because we know that history tells us that we cannot rely upon any other nationality to do what's right by us. We know that, so we can't even consider that. Whether it's a black female's chance to lead, I don't know. Or whether it's a black male's chance to continue to lead, I don't know. But I do know that you cannot turn this city over to Europeans in Mississippi with the history that the government has had in Mississippi. You cannot do that. In many ways, that's what happened in integration. We turned our children over to those who did not have their best interests at heart, and we lost control of our children. Dr. Henderson, I've enjoyed our dialogue this evening. Do you have any parting shouts?
Well, I just want to say the city of Jackson and Hinds County and some of the surrounding small towns have some serious days ahead. And if they don't pool their resources and come up with some kind of regional concerns economically, where they solve their water, their internet problems, and their public works department and police, they're going to be so terribly wrong at the end of 6 months until they might give up themselves. They just might say, I am going to resign, say we have lost it. And a lot of people then will be smiling all over this state.
We hope it doesn't come to that, but until we meet again, we'll be back next Friday. And until then, you have a great weekend and stay safe. Good night. Good evening. I'm Socrates Garrett, and we're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi, the heart of the Deep South, right here in an African-American-owned broadcasting studio. We believe digital.com, our own platform. And so it's critically important that in the African-American community, we control the narrative. I look forward to receiving opportunities to show and advertise your products for goods and services and to move your brand along in this community. We're broadcasting live on Facebook. When We Believe Digital Podcast, go to Roku and download our app, and We Believe Global, with shows like this to bring articulate, intelligent conversations and dialogue to our platform. So I'm here to continue sounding the alarm. This is how the South is going